It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
I am Iron Man.
I'm Pickle Rick!
I have a dream.
I am your father.
I'm Sean Spencer. This is my partner, Gus Silly Pants Jackson.
I'm gonna show you how great I am.
God bless America.
Avengers!
Assemble.
That's life. That's life. That's what all the people say. You're riding high in April, shot down in May. But I know I'm gonna change that tune. When I'm back on top in June. I said that's life. That's life. And it's funny.
Well, welcome back to life, you beautiful humans. I know I've been gone a minute, but I've been on vacation. I've also been sick, and it's been very hard to keep my voice up where it needs to be to rant on a podcast. But I'm feeling better. We're coming back in full force, full fury. I have a bunch of stuff coming to the social medias. So you need to follow at That's Life with Jacob on social media. Because if you're not following at That's Life with Jacob on social media, then you won't know what's coming. So I'm basically giving you the answers to the test before I give you the test, okay? At That's Life with Jacob on social media, TikTok, Instagram. It's a lot of fun. A bunch of exclusive content, a bunch of exciting things coming to the podcast. Only going up from here, and that's all thanks to you. Now, on today's episode, I'm going to be the most controversial I think I've ever been. And I know I'm going to lose a big core of my audience, but it has to be said. We have to talk about it. You know, I made mention at the beginning of this podcast that I don't want this podcast to be political at all. I don't want to talk about politics. I don't want to talk about race, religion. I don't want to talk about anything that's going to be divisive. I want to talk about stuff like Taco Bell and, you know, other random crap. But I couldn't sit back any longer. So on today's episode, we're talking Marvel versus DC. You're going to find out why I choose who I choose. You're going to find out a little backstory on both Marvel and DC comics. But many of you know the Marvel and DC franchises simply off of their movies. And we're going to talk a little bit about that as well. But you're talking to somebody, or you're hearing from somebody that has read the source material for both Marvel and DC since I was 9 years old, 8 years old. I have well over probably 2,000 comics. If you know what the Funko Pops are, I have well over 500 Funko Pops. I have Marvel tattoos on my arm, so it's probably pretty easy to guess which way I lean in the Marvel-DC battle, but I think there's a lot that goes into it. So it's going to be a really fun episode. So let's get into Marvel versus DC.
I'm Batman. Hulk! Smash!
So as I said, I'm not going through the history of comic books today, nor am I going to go through the history of DC and Marvel. You see, that's very rich history. There's a ton of crazy stories that are included in that. So those are going to be individual episodes on the history of DC, the history of Marvel, the history of comics, because from bankruptcies to characters flopping to companies absorbing other companies, it is a messy, messy, wild, crazy history that has got us to the point where we know the brands Marvel and DC. You see, DC didn't actually come about until about 1940, although their comic books had been around since about their original comic book artist and company started at about 1936, but a lot of the characters that we know of, like Superman, 1938, Batman, 1939, Wonder Woman, 1941, Green Lantern, 1940, The Flash, 1940, Aquaman, 1941, Cyborg, which is one of the more popular DC characters of all time, like the 1980s, in the newer stuff. But a lot of the original DC characters that everybody knows and loves today didn't come under the brand of DC until about 1941. Detective Comics, which was the brand that Batman was published under, adopted the initials DC because of its popularity, and then formed the company DC Comics, which entailed Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman, Green Lantern, The Flash, and so on and so on. And then the brand Marvel, actual brand Marvel, didn't come around until about 1961, although Captain America was published in 1942. So although some well-established Marvel characters that we know and love had been around since 1940. The actual brand Marvel Comics wasn't around until about 1961, and I think it first published with the Fantastic Four, if I'm not mistaken, was the first comic book published under the brand name Marvel Comics. So like I said, there's so much insane history that comes along with that. I just kind of wanted to hit a few highlights. What I think is so important with the early comic book talk here is the fact that Marvel's big hitters, I guess Marvel's big hitters that we would consider big hitters today, like Spider-Man, the Fantastic Four, a lot of these bigger names, weren't popular when the Marvel brand, I guess, so to speak, was booming, when comic books were booming. Because comic books early on, DC was king. I mean, think about the labels that DC had under its umbrella. A lot of DC's power started from the beginning. A lot of their popularity, a lot of their brand name started all the way back in the 1938s, 1940s. That's the big crazy part about Marvel versus DC is DC has been well more established. DC has had its more popular characters earlier on in their career. And then Marvel came along much later with a lot of its more established, more well-known characters. And it's kind of weird to see the growth of Marvel over DC right now. And we'll talk about the film industry here in a second. But even comic book-wise, Spider-Man wasn't around until the 1960s. Well, Marvel, I say Marvel in quotation marks, the brand that was publishing Marvel Comics had Captain America in 1940. So DC started out with its bangers. Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman, Green Lantern, The Flash, Aquaman. All of those characters were 1941 and down. From 1938 to 1941, the biggest names in DC history that we still know of today, that we still love today, were founded all the way back then. Were name brands like the Fantastic Four, Spider-Man, 1961. You see Captain America, Iron Man, some of these characters were literally throwaways that Marvel never really thought would be any more successful than what they were. And that's why it's going to be so fun to talk about the history of Marvel and DC because, I mean, Marvel was selling the rights to characters, to different publishers, to different cartoonists, just trying to make a couple bucks to keep their company afloat. If I said Marvel literally was struggling with the name Captain America, half of you would laugh at me. If I told you in 1941, 1942, when DC was booming, Marvel put out a banger like we know of as Captain America today, the man that literally lives on my shoulder rent-free, tattooed on me forever. If I said that Marvel was struggling with a name brand like Captain America, some of you would laugh. Now, I'm not saying struggling as in he wasn't popular. Captain America was very, very popular, but the company as a whole was not producing the characters that we know of and love so much today until much later on in its history. I mean, 20 years is a big history gap. For a company to survive 20 years before they put out characters like Spider-Man and the Fantastic Four and so on, is pretty remarkable in and of itself. I don't want to get into the history of Marvel versus DC. Of Marvel and DC. I genuinely want to keep that awesome stuff to the full episodes because it is so fun. But I think it's interesting that I really didn't know it until I researched a lot of it, that DC really was well more established than Marvel with its big hitters like Superman and Batman well before Marvel. Think about Batman. Batman alone was giving DC everything that it could ever ask for. So DC was well established very early on, and by very early on, literally within the first 2 years of the company. Flash forward to Marvel, or the brand that we know as Marvel. I mean, literally, it was saved off of Stan Lee's hand. Stan Lee was told, yo, companies get ready to go under. You better go back to the newspaper as a cartoonist. You better go back to the newspaper as a writer. Hell, go back to the war. We don't care, but we ain't got nothing for you. Company's getting ready to go belly up. So if you've got any characters shoved in a notebook somewhere, throw it out on a piece of paper. We'll print it for 10 cents, and we'll, make a quick buck and hopefully get out of here debt-free. That's literally the story of Marvel Comics. And so Stan Lee goes, oh, okay, well, I've got this character right here. His name is Spider-Man. And by the way, we'll talk about this more with the history of Marvel Comics. Spider-Man was not considered a banger, as the kids would say nowadays, when he was first brought up. When Stan Lee came before the front office and said, I have a character, his name is Spider-Man, they almost laughed him out of the building. So they did an issue with that. This is one of my favorite stories from Stan Lee, is Stan Lee said that they were telling him he was insane, he was crazy, you can't have a superhero that's a teenager that has problems, you know, your superheroes have to be basically omnipotent, omniscient, they can't have any flaws. And he said, no, I want to make a teenager, I want to make a high schooler that not only struggles with trying to get good grades, but is struggling to be a superhero, and I want to name him Spider-Man. They go, all right, well, you're absolutely insane, old man, but since this company's going belly up, print an issue. And then, you know, the legend lives on. They came back to him that very next week after they put the book out for sale and said, hey, you know that Spider-Man guy? Why don't you keep doing that, Stan? And, you know, Spider-Man is probably, besides Batman and Superman, I would say Spider-Man is probably Marvel's Batman. Because Superman, while he is very popular, Batman tends to be more popular than Superman by standard polling, by comic book sales. And so, I mean, Spider-Man is Marvel's Batman. You know, it's their go-to, the face of the brand. And it was literally done because the comic books were going under. And they had no money. And Stan Lee threw it out there. And then infamously became the most popular character. Might be most popular character in the world. If I really think about it, Spider-Man is probably the most popular character in the world. If I took a picture of Spider-Man to the most remote place in the entire world, like literally they've never seen anybody outside of their 10 by 10 village, and I walked up to them with a picture of Spider-Man, well, first they probably tried to behead me and eat me because they'd never seen such good-looking meat. Hey-oh! But if I took a picture of Spider-Man to that tribe or that village or wherever, in the middle of nowhere, they didn't speak a lick of English, they've never seen anybody else besides the 40 people that live there, and I showed them the picture, every single one of them will point and go, nom, 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 Spider-Man. They would know. They would know it's Spider-Man. So I will die on the hill that Spider-Man is the most popular character in the entire world. Now, I say all of that stuff to say this. I find it very interesting that DC has kind of plateaued since 1941. Now they've added a few characters here or there. Characters like Cyborg are very, very popular. The Teen Titans is a very, very popular comic book issue now. And that kind of stuff didn't come around until the 80s and 90s when weird robot men and green people that could turn into any kind of animal in the entire world, weird crap like that was super popular, hence things like the Guardians of the Galaxy and stuff really took popularity in the 1980s, and all these weird off comics that are now, you know, of course, big in today's society. All those weird issues really started getting big in the 70s, 80s, and 90s because it was a very weird time. But from the beginning, DC has already played its hand. Since 1938 to 1941, DC basically said, these are our 6 best characters, and, you know, we're just gonna rock with them. And while I really feel Marvel Comics especially, and I get it, I read more Marvel Comics, I still actively read and go to comic book stores. Yes, comic book stores exist. No, it's not a bunch of fat guys with Captain America t-shirts that are all virgins living in their mom's basement, but there's definitely 1 or 2 of them, okay? We don't like to stereotype that everybody that is a comic book nerd is a nerd, okay? There's some cool ones out there. Nah, I'm a big nerd, I get that, but there's some cool ones out there. But DC basically said, yo, these are our 7 characters, we're good. And don't get me wrong. If you have the hits, it's kind of like Michael Jackson. If the Thriller album does so well, do you really need to do the final tour album? Because besides what? Love never felt so good, and I dive it ever could. Whatever that album is, I forget what the name of that one is. But it's the one where it's like the gold background. And he's got like a metal brace around his neck. It's super weird. But Justin Timberlake's on that song. Besides like 2 songs, no one cares about the new albums. Everybody goes back to, 'cause it's a thriller night. Like we go back to that, and that's what DC does. That's what DC has always done with their comic books. Why be inventive? DC just goes, oh, what's Marvel doing? Everybody always thinks it's Marvel ripping off DC, and there's definitely a ton of Marvel ripping off DC, but Marvel always seems to do it better. I don't know why, they just do. Suicide Squad or Guardians of the Galaxy? 90% of you are going to choose Guardians of the Galaxy. I get it. It's probably because of the movie, and the movies were so successful, and Chris Pratt makes those movies so much fun, but even in the comic book issues, like, DC has always been don't care to me. They don't care about their comic books. They don't. DC's like, yo, we're going to write another Superman comic. And Superman is basically just going to beat up everybody. And someone's going to pull out a little green rock. And it's going to make him weak for about a second. But then after he doesn't look at the green rock, or the green rock's not touching him, or the green rock's not near him, he'll be able to just basically beat up anything that's ever existed in the history of the universe. Oh, real intriguing story writing. But you see, that's what comics were built on. Because I know there's going to be some people I know that are big nerds that like this podcast and listen to it all the time, and you're going to argue with me. That's what comic books were founded on. It was all about a power complex. It was all about a superhero complex where basically nothing could ever happen to your hero. Guess what? You know what people found out? That's boring. No one wants to see a character that can't have anything done bad to him. No one wants to see a character that basically always ends up having great things happen to him. How boring is a story when it's like, well, Jonathan stubbed his toe, but at the end of the day, he won $20 million. How about, like, Jonathan survived assassination attempt when he won his $20 million? And then, you know, he hides in a bunker to this day. It's like, oh, that's an intriguing story. But DC's always done this. The brand stands for don't care. They don't care about their comics. Since 1938, they were printing money, and they go, and this is the problem I have with the DC film. I'll get to the films in a second, Jacob. Slow your horse. Slow your horses. Okay. Stick with the comic books right now. They have a god complex with all of their characters. It's a power fantasy, is actually the right word. Which is, you know, all their characters are basically untouchable. And while they might have slight weaknesses, their stories aren't compelling. You see, what Stan Lee started, that has been the trend of Marvel Comics to this day, and has driven the success of Marvel Comics to this day, is Stan Lee created a character in Spider-Man that had flaws. Created a character that was a teenager that had to deal with real life stuff. You see, up until then, comic book characters, especially on the DC side and on the Marvel side, like Captain America fought in World War II. He was in, like, when he came about the scene, it was during World War II, and it was actually a comic book that was basically trying to get people to sign up for the war. Straight up. Trying to get people to donate money to the war. So, like, if it wasn't for propaganda, it was a power complex. And Stan Lee walked into an office, said, I'm going to make this character. His name is Spider-Man. He's going to be a teenager. He's going to have problems. He's going to struggle with math homework and trying to save the world. He's going to struggle with relationship issues and trying to save his not even the world, but his neighborhood. And he's going to fail a lot of the times, but that's what makes you love that character. That's what makes Spider-Man so compelling. That's what makes it the #1 selling comic book all the time. That's why there's 10 different issues of Spider-Man by 10 different artists with 10 different writers. You want to know why? Because people are actually interested in that story. No one wants to watch. It's the same thing if you... This is a whole nerd episode, by the way, if you can't tell. For those of you who are watching the Kenobi series, I'm not going to spoil it. I'm probably going to do a review on it. The problem I have with that story is that the villains have a power complex. Nothing wrong can happen to them. They're always right. They never fail. They're always powerful. They're always beating the good guy. And it's just like, if no one's ever vulnerable, you're a pretty boring ass person. You know what I'm talking. Don't you judge me. You know that girl or that guy. Oh, well, Susie's just always happy, and Susie always gets what she wants, and she works a great job, has a great husband, has 2 beautiful kids. She won the lottery 7 different times in her life. She has a brand new Tesla that compliments her every time she gets in because she's so nice. Like, you know that person. You know that guy. Well, he always gets the beautiful girl. He's always got a great job. He's always got money in his bank. His truck's lifted 35 inches high, and that's so cool for some reason. Like, you know those people. And guess what? I would guarantee you, put money down. They're boring as hell. Money down. Triple down. I'm all in. Sliding the chips to the table. Those are the most boring people you would ever know. Give me somebody that's been through some stuff. Like, I like the story of the people who are... things don't go great for them. I talked to a man, and this is not a joke, people. I talked to a man who said to my face, he's like, yo, one time I tried to stab Elvis. I go, I'm sorry, what did you just say to me? He's just like, yeah. I was like 6 years old, and my dad gave me a knife and told me I should go stab Elvis. What the frick? I want to talk to that guy at a party. I don't want to talk to Susie. Susie, how you doing? I'm great. Oh, good for you. Stupid Susie. Like, give me the people. I also don't want to talk to the other person. You're just, how are you? And they're just like, life's awful. You know, like Eeyore. Life sucks. It's like, oh, yeah, life does suck. Tell me an interesting story so that maybe your life sucks, but I can get a laugh out of it. You know what I mean? You know what I mean. The way, I don't know why my brain goes where it goes. But that's DC's problem. They waited way too long to try and make their characters interesting, to try and make them have problems. Like, Superman's biggest problem was where he's going to eat for dinner. Superman, thank you for saving me. Not a sweat. Now, which one of these pizza joints is open? They're all closed. I guess I'll have to fly halfway around the world, turn back time an hour so that way it's open. Da-da-da. And then DC's like, yo, we're going to print this same crap for years. I mean, I find it interesting that DC has very famous issues, not necessarily series. You see, the X-Men versus the Avengers, that's a very, very popular series. House of M, a very popular series. Civil War, a very popular series. The Infinity Gauntlet Saga, a very popular series. While DC does have popular series, I would say they have more great one-off issues. Batman, Year One. Halloween Night. The Death of Superman was a really... I wouldn't even say it's a really good series. It's got some really good issues in its mini-series. Because it's only, I don't even remember how many books. It's been years since I've read them and pulled them out of my comic book collection. But I think it's only like 8 or 9 books. And as far as I can recall, I can only remember like 3 of those issues being compelling and fun and great to read. You see, Stan Lee dared to do what nobody else would do, which is put someone that's vulnerable, that has real-life issues, and then make them also have the burden of being a superhero. It's brilliant. People like to be relatable. People like to be related to. They like to be able to relate to things. And even though it's silly, for some people, it means a lot to them that they can relate to Spider-Man. It means a lot to them that they can relate to the Fantastic Four. Listen, like a lot of people, I get it. It's funny and I'm not trying to get too serious here, but like comic books have saved a lot of people's lives. Certain superheroes have given people the confidence to be who they are today. So if you can relate to that superhero and you're not living up to the most insane expectations, I mean, that helps. Now, I'm not saying that you have to live up the expectation of shooting laser beams out of your eyes and flying around the world, but if you can relate to their real life problem, like, yo, Superman's got to do his laundry too, that sucks, so do I. Like, one of my all-time favorite comic books of all time, I say that was the most redundant crap I've ever said in my life. One of my all-time favorites of all time. My all-time favorite comic book might be a miniature Hawkeye series. And the entire series is literally just Hawkeye having to be a normal dude and be like a superhero, like it's a 9-to-5 job. Like he goes home and his power goes out and he can't heat up his burrito in the microwave. And then the Avengers call and they need him. And how pissed he is. It's like, son of a gun. I gotta go to save the world. I haven't even had a burrito yet. That's probably one of my favorite comic book issues. You can relate to that. You wake up late so you can't run and go get your normal daily coffee. So then you're pissed for the rest of the day. Like just watching Clinton Barton be pissed that he has to save the world because he hasn't had lunch. That's great reading. So in the comic book column, I guess what this narrows down to is we're keeping a tally sheet here. In the comic book column, check mark Marvel. Any day of the week, check mark Marvel. Now let's talk about the films. Speaking of don't care, DC doesn't care about their films. I'm very passionate about the films, by the way. You want to know why? Because the films are a lot of people's first introduction ever to the superhero. So many people. Guys, trust me, I know, I see you there every time opening night with your girlfriends who sit there and go, who's Thor? Who's Thor's girlfriend? Who's that rock guy? Well, that's Korg. That's one of Thor's friends. He was in Ragnarok. What's a Ragnarok? Oh, dear Lord. But like, films are how the daily people relate to these heroes. Films are what are keeping the comic book industry alive. Because you know how many new readers we're getting? The other day, I walked into a comic book store on the good Lord as my witness, on the Lord on high. I saw 2 females. No, you're right. 2 females. They weren't tied up. They didn't have their mouths balled and gagged and were screaming for help. No. They were there on their own free will. They weren't parents of anybody. They weren't saying, come on, Steven, we gotta go. No, they were there willingly reading comic books. That's the power of the film industry when it comes to comic book movies nowadays. Comic book movies are now saving the comic book industry. Comics have never been more popular than they are now. You've never had more comic book stores than you do right now. You want to know how I know that? Because I live in Franklin, Tennessee, and there's 3 of them within 5 minutes of driving. Growing up, you had to make a trip to the comic book store. There was one of them in a town that nobody could pronounce the name of that had 39 people. Yo, listen, I drove to Valparaiso, Indiana as a kid to buy comic books from a guy that literally just owned comic books. I'm pretty sure it wasn't even a shop. He opened up his front door and had 30 comic books on a table. That's what I grew up with. There was a comic book store owned by a comic book guy. That's what we called him. There wasn't employees. There was an employee. You see, the movie industry has allowed the comic book industry to produce more, to hire employees, to grow. Look at brand merchandise. Funko Pops. For those of you who don't know what a Funko Pop is, it's basically a bobblehead. I have 500 of them. Brand merchandise, clothing, car decals, stickers. That's all being driven right now from the movie industry. I would place a wager that 4 out of 5 kids went as a Marvel or DC superhero for Halloween. That wasn't what it was when I was a kid. There was superheroes, there was Batman movies, there were Spider-Man movies, and yes, of course I dressed up as all of them, but I mean, we were having to get creative. You know, I was a butcher one year. I was Johnny Appleseed one year. Listen, guys, it doesn't get much cooler than a 9-year-old kid dressed as Johnny Appleseed with a metal pan on his head. Like, it's crazy to see what the film industry has done for the comic book industry. You know, these comic book stores that I grew up with now get to live on because of the franchises. And this is what's so disrespectful about DC. You see, Marvel went into it, right? They named it the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Boom! Marvel Studios, Marvel Cinematic Universe, Marvel Studios. We're going to create our own company that produces movies from our comic books. Now, just so we're on the same page here, and I'm not just kissing Marvel's butt, Marvel has not produced banger after banger after banger. There's been some flops. We have a different Rhodey from Iron Man 1 to Iron Man 2. Don Cheadle was a much better choice. We have a different Hulk from the movie The Incredible Hulk. A completely different Hulk, completely different storyline. To Mark Ruffalo's Hulk. We have movies like The Eternals, which I don't care what any of you say, is one of the worst made films I've ever put into my mind. We have several things that are not perfect in the Marvel Studios Marvel Cinematic Universe. But what we do have is a plan. What Marvel has always had is a plan. They've had someone at the helm named Kevin Feige who has said, this movie will lead into this movie will lead into this movie, this story will lead into this story, this character will interact with this character. That way you can build up to an Avengers type movie. That's why Avengers Infinity War can take place. That's why Avengers Endgame can take place. That's why you can have 26 movies gaining new fans every single year as opposed to a TV series or a movie series dying off after 5 seasons. That's why you can produce 7 Spider-Man movies and people still care. That's why you can get these big name actors to buy into year after year into a contract because they understand that this is a bigger story than just the Iron Man 1. This is a bigger story than just Captain America First Avenger. Captain America is going to be leading his troops saying Avengers Assemble all the way in Avengers Endgame. 10 movies later, 12 movies later. That's why Marvel can be so successful with 26 movies. That's insane. There's like 29 James Bonds. And the only ones that people care about are the Daniel Craigs. Marvel was built with a plan. They executed that plan. While there has been flaws throughout Marvel, while there are movies that I dislike, while I hate Captain Marvel with every fiber of my being, not because she's a powerful woman character, because I absolutely loved the first Wonder Woman that DC put out. I love powerful women characters when they're written properly, but for the fact that she had what I said is the Superman complex, which is she's untouchable, she's the greatest thing ever, blah, 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 blah. She can kill Thanos with one punch, blah, 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 blah. Get out of here. Scarlet Witch is a compelling character. Look at her growth in Doctor Strange and Multiverse of Madness. It's not without its bumps in the road. It's not without its flaws. But it is with a plan. And a plan can go a long way. You ever coached before? I coach full time. When I walk into a game without a plan, I look like the dumbass, not my girls. When I walk in and go, oh, we're going to try really hard. Great. You're going to lose. Marvel came out with a plan. They've executed that plan. They now have TV series that are booming. WandaVision, Loki, Moon Knight. They're bringing in all of these weird characters and they're buying into who they are as a brand. I love the fact that Kevin Feige doesn't shy away from Guardians of the Galaxy, which was one of my all-time favorite comic books before they even made it a movie. I love Rocket Raccoon. I have Groot tattooed onto my arm. I love the fact that Kevin Feige said, not only do I have a plan, but we're not going to make the same boring story like we are with Superman over and 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 over again. No. We're going to bring in the Guardians of the Galaxy. We're going to have a TV show called Moon Knight that most people are going to scratch their heads going, what the crap am I watching? And the nerd in me is loving it so much. I love the fact that he's not afraid to take chances. Have all of those chances paid off? Nope. But Marvel has a plan. They're growing the brand of Marvel. That is why Marvel is so superior to DC in the film industry. It's not even close because DC has no plan. They go, we're going to start with Superman. Perfect. That's a great one. I'm not a big fan of Man of Steel. The only reason I'm not a big fan of it, I thought it was way too boring, way too long and drawn out. And I thought for the simple fact that Superman killed Zod at the end goes completely against the character of Superman. Superman doesn't kill people. He stops people. There's a big difference. He didn't have to snap Zod's neck in half. Fight me on this one. That was the only way. The only way he could stop Zod from killing everybody in Metropolis. Everybody died anyways. So what's the he snaps his neck after 12 million people have already died because Superman's just crashing into buildings willy-nilly with people in them? That's not how that works. That's such poorly written content. Let me murder half of Metropolis, but then I'll snap this one guy's neck to save Metropolis. Well, it's already destroyed! Guys, I'm very passionate about comic books. Can't you tell? If I'm willing to put these permanently on my body in tattoo form, I think I should be able to speak pretty passionately about them. But they start with Superman. Great. Let's start with Superman. He snaps, like, I'm not even going to get into the individual films because I could rip on them all day long. Great. Now let's, are we going to do a Batman movie? Well, no. Oh, okay. That's kind of weird. We're not going to do a Batman movie? No. We're going to do a Batman vs. Superman movie. Oh, are we going to, like, have a solo Batman film so we can introduce this version of Batman? People know who Batman is. Yeah, but it's going to be a really confusing story when we're trying to introduce Bruce Wayne and introduce why he wants to fight Superman all in the same movie. Don't worry, we're going to throw in Wonder Woman and a cave troll at the very end that they all have to fight. I'm out! I'm good! Look at Wonder Woman. First Wonder Woman. Fantastic. I thought it was written well. I liked the story. It was very enjoyable. Second Wonder Woman. Biggest pile of dog crap I've ever seen since insert whatever other DC movie that I haven't talked about yet here. The original Suicide Squad. The first Justice League. The Snyder Cut. Don't even get me started on the Snyderverse. Oh my dear. There's just Zack Snyder has a cult following. It's not good DC content. It's not good DC characterizations or character development. This isn't good DC films. This isn't good DC comic book movies. There is no plan. They gave Zack Snyder a handful of characters and said, go nuts, we'll give you $700 million. And he made trash like Superman, Man of Steel, Batman vs. Superman, the original Justice League that was end up being finished by Joss Whedon. And then the Snyder Cut came out like several years later and it was 4.5 hours long. And it really didn't take much away from the original Justice League except for the fact that he introduced a bunch more characters that you didn't care about. The CGI was terrible because they don't care about the story. Zack Snyder loves superheroes. He's bad with character development, which is pretty bad when all you have for your source material is comic books. If you don't know how to develop a character on screen, you're not going to have a successful franchise. Aquaman, people loved it. It's one of the highest grossing films of all time because people are desperate. These characters have been around since 1940. Grandpas that are 112 years old went into Aquaman going, I hope this is good. It's the last film that I'll watch before I die. And then they watched that horse crap, even though I really like Jason Momoa and I really like parts of it, but then when he fought Bible Man at the very end, I'm out! And that 112-year-old died unhappy because of DC being a trash film organization. There's no head at Warner Brothers. The head of Warner Brothers just gives out hundreds of millions of dollars and just goes, go crazy, everybody. You want to make a film? You make a DC film. I'm pretty sure I could literally copyright a DC comic book, send it in, and pretend that it's my words and my storyline, and they would give me a franchise film tomorrow. This is brilliant, Johnson. I wonder where this kid got all these ideas. How about read the books? Read the source material. Why do you think Marvel's successful? They care about the source material. They care about where this content comes from. DC doesn't. It stands for doesn't care. Ah! You have literally years and years and decades of material that you could develop stories on. And DC fails every which way. The only successful movies I've enjoyed from DC, The Joker, which is very hard to even be considered a DC film. It's a very good movie. I wouldn't necessarily call it a DC film, but let's go with it. And the new Batman, thoroughly enjoyed it. That is taking good source material. That's taking The One Halloween Night. That's taking Batman Year One. That's taking source material, developing it into a compelling story that people actually cared about. The original Wonder Woman, taking content, taking books. There's very few of those films in the DC, and the problem is when you head into something with no plan, everybody gets to operate on their own ideas, their own assumptions, their own versions, their own takes on the source material, and or they don't even have to use the source material, because look at what Zack Snyder said in Comic-Con. He goes, we influenced a lot of the visual aspects from this book, but the story that we created is a story that we created ourselves in a boardroom. Why? You have the answers to the test. You have literally decades of amazing source material. I'm not even considering it amazing source material. You have decades of source material, though. Marvel has decades of amazing source material. DC has decades of source material. You can't spin something decent out of all of those decades of source material? I just don't get it. Someone at Warner Brothers needs to sit down. They need to find their Kevin Feige. And they need to start from the beginning. Because you have all of this source material that you could use. You have individual issues from the DC Comics that would be really compelling, really interesting stories, like the death of Superman. That would be a great trilogy. Guess what? You can't just automatically have him die in Batman vs. Superman 2 Doomsday, who's not even established yet. It's terrible writing, terrible cinematography, there's absolutely zero vision, and all they're doing is throwing DC Comics further and further into the dumps. You go to a comic book store tomorrow. Marvel sells out 10 times more than DC, mark my words. There's great one-offs like The Batman, The Joker, Wonder Woman. But if none of this is going to tie in, if all of this is going to be individual, then don't put it under the brand of the DC Film Corporation. You see, the new Batman movie, they used source material, they cared about source material, they were successful. So, another check mark into Marvel's box when it comes to the film industry. And lastly, this one will be brief. Look at the array of characters from Marvel. Look at the array of characters from DC. There are more notable characters from the Marvel franchise, from the Marvel comics, than there are from the DC comics. I would argue a little bit that DC has maybe the top 3 out of 5 most recognizable characters. And in no particular order, I would say Superman, Batman, probably Wonder Woman over the Flash, and then I would say Captain America and Spider-Man. Those are probably the top 5 most recognizable worldwide. Maybe the Flash over Wonder Woman. That one's going to be close, though, because Wonder Woman has been around. It's had its own TV show. I guess in today's day and age, the Flash TV show is pretty big, too. But even though they have some of the most recognizable, most popular characters of all time, it's what you do with those characters. It's the development of those characters. And also it's creating new, likable, lovable characters. DC's not done that. They're not developing their great storylines. They're not developing new characters. The Teen Titans started out as an amazing animated series. And then short comic books. So as far as best overall characters, that ticks over to Marvel for me. Because I can give you a list of 30 different Marvel characters that if I showed you a picture, you would know who they are. If I gave you a list of 30 different DC characters, you would scratch your head after 7. So another tick to Marvel. I do want to talk about one more little thing here. The animated series goes hands down to DC. Marvel's got to step up its animated game. Ain't nobody do cartoons like DC. They might not care about everything else. Their live action, terrible. Their comic books, not very good. Their animated Batman series, their animated Superman series, their animated, any series. The best. The best. DC dominates when it comes to the animated series. Any day of the week, I'll watch it. As a grown man, I'll watch animated DC stuff well over live action DC stuff. The new Harley Quinn show, very enjoyable. It's a cartoon. Anything Batman animated, awesome. And I would beg the question, for those of you who are giant Batman fans and Superman fans, I would say that you're more of a fan of the cartoons than you actually are the characters and the comics themselves. And I would believe that I'm probably pretty close to accurate on that one. So Marvel ticks all the boxes except one. DC, you're reigning high on the animated series. Marvel's got to step up its animated game. But other than that, for me personally, I think Marvel ticks every box. I'd love to hear from you. because I know there's a lot of nerds that listen to this podcast. So what do you think? Are you a Marvel camp? Are you a DC camp? Why? Why not? Make sure you're following at That's Life with Jacob on Instagram so you can play along on my story and vote and tell me why. I'll share my favorite reasons as to why you're a Marvel or DC person on my story. So check us out at That's Life with Jacob on social media. Once again, everybody, I love you guys. I've missed you. We are back, ready to rock and roll. I'm Jacob Courtwright, and that's life.
That's life. That's life. That's what all the people say. You're riding high in April, shot down in May.